Good morning. Bonjour à tous. Je suis Charlie Angus, député fédéral de Timmins Bay James. D'abord, je voudrais exprimer ma profonde préoccupation pour les habitants de Kashechewan. Ce matin, il y a 222 cas de COVID dans le village et il y a 144 enfants qui sont touchés par le COVID. Ce n'est pas acceptable. Le ministre Miller a échoué son obligation de protéger la population vulnérable de Bay James. Depuis une semaine, les communautés de Kashechewan ont demandé le soutien de l'armée canadienne et des tentes d'isolement. Mais M. Blair et M. Miller ont refusé d'aider la communauté. Et maintenant, il y a une crise qui représente une catastrophe médicale. Hier, le gouvernement a envoyé une équipe militaire, mais c'est très tard pour le gouvernement de répondre à cette crise-là. J'appelle le gouvernement fédéral à respecter son obligation de garantir l'assistance médicale pour les communautés de Bay James. Good morning. Before we get on to the affairs of the day, I want to express my deep concern for the situation of the families in Bay James right now, particularly in the village of Kashechewan, where this morning we learned there are now 222 cases of COVID. 144 of those are children. I know many of these families. They are living 15 to 20 people to a home. We have children who are already vulnerable to mold, to lung damage, compromised immune systems. This disaster sits at the door of Minister Miller. It was his staff who told the community that they weren't getting isolation tents, that they could keep people affected with COVID in the houses that were vastly overcrowded, and now it's running rampant through the children. A week ago, we asked Minister Blair to send in the army to work with the community because they were being overwhelmed, and the government refused and said they were going to assess the situation, and every night the COVID numbers grew. 20, 30, 40 cases at a time, and they still didn't do anything. So today, Minister Miller's no doubt going to say, hey, I'm sending in support. It's a little too late. He owns this 1,000%. He should have been there from the beginning with the community to protect them and to protect the people in Ottawa-Piscat, Moosonee, and Fort Albany. I'm calling on Minister Miller to do the right thing and get as much support as is necessary. Perhaps Minister Miller was so busy preparing for his court case against Indigenous children that he forgot the children of Kashechewan. It's been just over a week since Parliament and his own caucus called on Justin Trudeau to end the toxic legal war against Indigenous children. $10 million in legal fees, 19 non-compliance orders, a ruling of systemic and willful, reckless discrimination against First Nation children. And when the Prime Minister says, hey, I'm not in court fighting any children, that's a lie. When they say, oh, we want to make sure that all the children are compensated, that's a lie. What they are bringing to court this morning is a demand to overturn the rulings of the Human Rights Tribunal. They do not want to be compliant. They're saying, actually, in their legal defense, that Canada is the party that was wronged here. Not the thousands of First Nation children and Indigenous kids in the broken foster care system. No, the government believes that they are the wronged party here. And what we're talking about are the lives of children. We lose a child every 3 days to this rotten, underfunded system. We lose a child on a Monday. We lose a child on a Wednesday. We lose a child on a Saturday. And nobody at the federal level has ever given a damn or made any substantive changes. And we are calling on the government to end this legal battle, to sit down and recognize that these are not historic harms. These are the ongoing harms that are happening today. And if you look at the Truth and Reconciliation report, the very first calls to action were about today, about this generation of children. So when Carolyn Bennett, Justin Trudeau, and Mark Miller say that they are going to respect the rulings of the TRC, then the first thing they need to do is stop the court battles, sit down with Cindy Blackstock, sit down with the First Nations, and identify a process forward to ensure the compensation for the children whose lives have been damaged, and put in a system that is no longer militantly underfunding Indigenous kids in this country. Thank you. Merci, Miigwech.
Like Charlie, I want to start off with expressing my deep concern about what's going on in Kashechewan. At the beginning of this pandemic, we said one of the worst possible things to happen would be if COVID-19, there was an outbreak in Indigenous community. Indigenous communities have been historically and continually underfunded when it comes to health resources. We had long known that if an Indigenous community was facing an outbreak, it would be disastrous. Well, that disastrous situation is exactly what's happening now in Kashechewan. Charlie mentioned over 220 cases. Those are numbers for an entire region. This is happening in one village, in one community. The entire community is being impacted. And as Charlie mentioned, kids are being impacted. I spoke with Chief Friday, and they need immediate emergency help now. And they're also calling for a long-term solution. They want to see, and they need to see, more housing. They need housing. That is a crisis, so we're not in this position again. So we're calling on this Liberal government, on Justin Trudeau, to do the right thing here. Deliver the immediate emergency help to support this community that's right now in a horrible disaster. They need help. And we need to see long-term solutions so they're never in this position ever again. We need housing in the north, and we need housing across Canada, but particularly right now, the chief has mentioned that housing is the solution. We need better housing, at least 200 units. And Charlie mentioned, maybe the reason why the Liberal government is not focusing on the kids who are disproportionately being impacted by this outbreak in Kashechewan is because they're busy fighting kids in court. Today is the day. We said in that motion, we called on Parliament. The Parliament called on this government, this Liberal government, to stop fighting these kids in court. For all the times that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals said they weren't fighting kids in court, well, you can walk over to the federal court today, and yes, the government of Canada is fighting a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision against Indigenous kids. It is happening right now. So I don't know how the Liberals can try to make up that they're not fighting them when we can just walk over to the federal court, and they are actually fighting them right now, today. So our call remains, Parliament's call remains, stop fighting these kids, deliver the justice that they deserve, fix the broken system, and deliver the immediate help to the community in Kashechewan. It is a crisis right now. This is our worst nightmare, that an Indigenous community would be faced with this. Donc, comme Charlie a dit, on doit, à ce moment, on doit agir pour protéger la communauté de Kashechewan. Ce qui se passe à ce moment, c'est exactement la pire situation qu'on a pensé parce qu'on a une communauté autochtone qui n'a pas accès aux ressources de santé, qui ont à ce moment une crise avec un chiffre de COVID-19 désastreuse. Donc, on doit les aider tout de suite. Je exige le gouvernement libéral et Justin Trudeau d'agir dès maintenant pour aider cette communauté. En plus, ce qui me frappe fort, c'est le fait que ce gouvernement continue de lutter contre les enfants autochtones. Et il continue de poursuivre les enfants autochtones en justice. À ce moment, aujourd'hui, dans la Cour d'appel fédérale, ils sont en train de continuer ces batailles contre les enfants. Donc, comme on a dit dans notre motion, on exige le gouvernement d'arrêter ces batailles, de livrer la justice pour la communauté autochtone et les enfants autochtones, et d'arrêter cette poursuite en justice. On va continuer de se battre pour la communauté autochtone et pour la justice. Et à ce moment, la communauté de Kashechewan a besoin d'aide immédiatement. Et on va continuer de mettre la pression sur Justin Trudeau d'arrêter la bataille contre les enfants autochtones. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. I'm ready for your questions.
And we'll now take questions, starting with questions on the phone. As usual, one question, one follow-up per reporter. Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions, commençant par les questions au téléphone. Comme à l'habitude, une question suivie par journaliste. Operator, do we have a first question?
Thank you. Merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. There will be a brief pause while the participant register for questions. Il y aura un cours d'élève permettant de vous enregistrer dans la file d'attente pour la période de questions. Thank you for your patience. Merci de patienter. La première question, the first question is from Marc-André Cossette, Global News. Please go ahead. Your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Singh. Thanks very much for taking our questions. I'd actually like to hear your thoughts on another matter, and that's the news over the weekend that the second in command of the Canadian Forces and the head of the Navy both went golfing earlier this month with General Jonathan Vance, who, as you know, remains under military police investigation. Do you think it was appropriate for Lieutenant General Rouleau and Vice Admiral Baines to go golfing with General Vance while he remains under investigation? And what message do you think this sends to the men and women of the military when they see one of the men at the top of the investigative process out golfing with a general who's still under investigation?
This is very problematic, and it sends a very bad message. And really, the reason why this is happening is because I blame directly the Minister of Defense and Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister. They are not taking this seriously. They're setting the tone, and they have ignored a crucial recommendation from the 2015 report done by a previous justice of the Supreme Court. So the fact that they are ignoring the key recommendation from that report shows they're not taking it seriously. The key recommendation was put in place an independent process. They failed to do that. And the sad reality is by failing to do that, by not taking this seriously, they have set a tone where it is not being considered a serious problem. And what happens as a result is that women continue to be ignored. Their complaints continue to be ignored. Their concerns be ignored. And it sends a very damaging message that women who raise concerns about inappropriate sexual conduct are going to be ignored in this country, are going to be ignored in the military. This is the highest office of the land, and this is the military, an institution that should be at the highest level of standards. And when it's ignoring the serious concerns raised by many women, retired or a Supreme Court justice, it sends a very damaging message. And this is just a continuation of that.
And as a follow-up, do you have confidence in the ability and the judgment of Lieutenant General Rouleau and Vice Admiral Baines to remain in their leadership roles in the military? And given what we've seen here, do you get the sense that senior leaders in the Canadian military just think they're untouchable?
I think that the Liberal government has sent this message. The Liberal government has sent a message that they are not interested in justice, in fairness. They're not interested in listening to women, and they have set the tone. And so when you've got a defense minister who ignores a very serious complaint and does nothing about it, when you've got a prime minister's office that ignores the complaint and a prime minister that ignores a recommendation, that is the leadership. That is the direction that's being set. That is the tone that's being set. So I blame directly the prime minister and the defense minister. And really, it is the prime minister at the end of the day that sets the tone. He is setting a tone that it does not matter whether there's serious complaints raised, that they will not be listened to, and that is very damaging to women, is very damaging to the military.
Opérateur, prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. Once again, please press star 1 on the telephone keypad for any question. De nouveau, n'hésitez pas à appuyer sur étoile 1 pour toute question. There are no more questions on the phone. Il n'y a plus de questions sur le téléphone.
And we'll now take questions in the room. Nous allons maintenant passer aux questions dans la salle. Man?
Good morning, Mr. Singh. Minister Miller actually this morning said the issue in question regarding the federal court case where the government is changing what you like to frame as the changing children of indigenous communities, indigenous First Nation, indigenous kids. He said the issue in question is actually compensation as issued by the tribunal, which is the government believe doesn't respect basic principle of proportionality. I mean, there's this. It's actually not the first time where he frames it this way. But what kind of message does this send to you?
It is a ludicrous claim. We've got one of the most respected institutions in this country, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, that has made multiple recommendations, multiple orders. And this Liberal government has failed to comply with multiple orders. And what the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal is laying out is just a bare minimum. And the fact that the Liberal government wants to fight the bare minimum, wants to spend millions of dollars fighting a decision from one of the highest tribunals respecting human rights in Canada really shows our lack of commitment. They are not interested in justice for Indigenous kids. They'd rather fight them. Why couldn't the Liberal government follow and comply with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal? And if there's additional damages or worse damages, they could figure that out. That doesn't preclude them from listening to the order of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. It is a ludicrous argument. They are wasting time and money and sending a very bad message to Indigenous kids and to the Indigenous communities that you don't matter by fighting them in court. It is a wrong thing to do. No matter which way the Liberal government tries to spin it, Justin Trudeau is sending lawyers to fight kids in court despite multiple human rights tribunal decisions. This is a respectable body with comprised of representation that understands the laws of Canada. And the fact that they're fighting this really underlines how little they care about Indigenous kids and the willful and reckless discrimination. There's a reason why those comments were included, because it was so bad that the tribunal had to include that clarification how bad it was. And despite that, they're fighting them in court.
Mr. Singh, I want to ask you a follow-up on a bit of different topic here. Regarding the amount of vaccines Canada has actually contracted to buy, the government announced that it's only by this point will donate only what the government actually already committed to under COVAX program. At this point, we don't know that the government is going to donate any further amounts of COVID-19 vaccines. What does this says, in your opinion, about Canada's commitment to end the pandemic globally?
I want to take a moment to reflect on the fact this is a global pandemic, and we've got a responsibility to fight it across the world. If the pandemic continues to rage in other parts of the world, it will impact us here. So not only is it the moral thing, the right thing to do, it is also the sensible thing to do. With the global pandemic, it will impact all of us if we don't tackle it everywhere in the world. But I want to really emphasize the most important tool to fighting this pandemic for countries that have less resources is a patent waiver. That's one of the things they've been calling for. The United States is committed to waiving the patent. To date, Justin Trudeau has failed to commit to whether or not Canada would agree with that patent waiver. The only people that benefit from not waiving the patent are the big pharmaceutical companies. And it has been a time and time again that Justin Trudeau has sided with the big pharmaceutical companies against Canadians and now against countries with less resources. That is the most important thing that we need to do as a nation, is to waive that patent protection so that poor countries with less resources, can produce the vaccine locally in their own countries. That will give them the tools to fight this pandemic. And to date, Justin Trudeau fails to do that. We absolutely need to do more to assist globally in the fight against this pandemic. And that is one tool that Justin Trudeau continues to deny countries with less resources.
Rafi?
Good morning, Rafik G. Canyon, CBC News. This could be for either one of you. So we know that the Heritage Minister is going to announce a new Indigenous Language Commissioner in a couple of hours from now. And then earlier this morning, the government also responded to TRC Call 17. So I guess I'm wondering, what do you make of this? And does it not show from them a willingness to do better?
Okay. I'll start off and then I'll have Charlie jump in on this one as well. I want to say, first of all, it's been 6 years. It's been 6 years since the TRC brought forward their calls to action. And they were very smart about this. They said calls to action, not recommendations. These were calls to action because they know the Liberal government ignores inquiry after inquiry, recommendation after recommendation. They do not put in place action. They do a lot of symbolic gestures, but they don't do the steps needed. So they named this calls to action because these are calls to action. 6 years with Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister, they've done a fraction of the calls to justice. And let's be very clear, Justin Trudeau campaigned very brazenly in 2015 saying, I will get it all done. I will complete all of the 94 calls to action. Well, 6 years in government, it has been abysmal, the fact that he's only done a fraction of those calls to action. So additional indications today don't make up for the complete abdication of responsibility over the past 6 years. Charlie?
I think what's really telling with the Trudeau government is that Parliament ordered them. The Liberals, backbenchers, called on the Prime Minister to end his court case. Instead, we see they're making announcements that they could have made last summer, they could have made a year ago, they could have made 2 years ago, 3 years ago. What they're picking and choosing out of the TRC calls to action are the stuff that politically doesn't cost them. But if you look at the TRC calls of action, the whole first group of calls for the government to move is on the broken child welfare system of today. So on the day that they are in court against Indigenous kids, I think it just stinks of hypocrisy that Minister Miller is saying he's got a plan and he's willing to work. The only time he's going to be willing to work is when he stops the war on Indigenous kids.
Thanks. And if I may ask a follow-up on an unrelated matter, your party put forward that motion to have an action summit on Islamophobia. The government is now saying, okay, we're committing to do that before the end of summer. What do you want to see come out of that summit?
Well, this is a demand from the Muslim community directly. And so when a community has suffered a horrible blow, the right thing to do is to listen to the community and to hear them out. And so they'll lay out some of the actions and work with experts in terms of laying out an action plan. There are some things we can do right away. And there are things that the Liberal government has promised to do for years and years. And those are some of the things that have to still happen. We know that the hate attacks that resulted in horrible losses in the Quebec shooting, the Quebec massacre in the masjid, in the mosque, and in Toronto where a Muslim man was knifed down. And again, in this case, we know that it's hate motivated. In those two previous cases, we know very clearly with evidence that the attackers were radicalized with online hate, that they visited extreme right-wing websites and social media, they visited white supremacist websites and social media, and that was what contributed to the radicalization. So as the Liberal government has promised to do, yet failed to have put in place, we need to tackle online hate. There are clearly groups that are pushing online hate. Online hate is clearly radicalizing people. Misinformation is resulting in divisive rhetoric that results in hate. We've seen this against Asian communities with the rise of anti-Asian hate, fueled by misinformation, targeting people of Chinese descent, increasing hate towards them and violence towards them. And with Muslims, it's very clear that online hate is being promoted to put their lives at risk. So that's one thing. Secondly, I've made a call, and others have said that there should never be any political party that ever uses dog whistle Islamophobia for political gain. That should just be completely off the table and never happen again. We know that it's happened. The Conservatives have done it with a number of bills, including the Barbaric Practices Hotline and bill, including the Bloc have done it with different ads. We need to stop that. It has to end. And finally, there are groups that continue to operate with impunity, white supremacist groups. There needs to be resources applied to dismantling those groups and that real threat to Canadian security, that our resources that are applied to keep Canadians safe are clearly not being put in the right direction. They need to be put towards those who are a real threat to Canadian safety. And so those are 3 steps that can be taken immediately.
And I'll check once again if we have one last question on the phone. Operator?
Thank you. Merci. There are no more questions on the telephone.
This concludes the press conference. Thank you. Ceci met fin la conférence de presse. Merci.
Thank you very much. Merci. Big shout out to Charlie.